Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In this episode, I wish to focus on memory. Memory in the individual, which collectively is cultural memory, because memory is important for remembering the things we have learned, not just histories, which are important, but how to construct technologies, how to use them, many things. I don't want to start pointing out all the obvious things that we use memory for. In previous episodes, I talked about individual memory becoming consolidated through experience. So every tree that we see isn't remembered, but we intuitively learn the concept of trees and bushes, people and mountains. Specific objects are remembered if they matter. And so for our own meaning making, we have a sort of selective forgetting. In today's technology, we could conceivably carry a microphone and camera with us everywhere we go. And Google's Glass and some of the later augmented and virtual reality glasses are starting to try and make that a reality. We still have privacy concerns and cultural taboos that make our current society not ready for such a move. And again, the early launch of Google Glass, which was admittedly an immature but relatively good technology, it failed because of social rejection. The sort of memory that's offered there, where everything gets recorded in video and audio format, the hours of your life documented and digitally preserved, is not the sort of memory that we have as people. Neural networks work more like compression algorithms. They distill the experience and get the gist out of things. They remember what's important and forget the majority of things. We find that with repetitive tasks, cyclical tasks, if we're working every day, then we might have a short-term recollection of what we did yesterday, maybe the day before, maybe even last week. But if we had to go back day by day, and the same can be said for school or whatever activity we do on a regular basis, and recall, we'd find that our recall fades, the memory drifts. And what we do is we gain competence in our tasks. Some memories may have been task or job specific. So we had a particular emergency 2 months ago where we were stretched. We were required to deal with some problems we hadn't dealt with before. And we remember that clearly. So we have a selective memory. We tend to merge repetitive things. The same path we walk every day gets merged into the path. We may not memorize every bush and every blade of grass on that path, but we probably remember the detail along the path more than a path we walk only once. Memory also takes time. It takes time to build and consolidate. These are all the biological memory mechanisms that predate humanity, but we still have inherited them, and now through the application of neural networks in computing through the various techniques of artificial intelligence, we are now copying them in silico, in machinery. Okay. Before then, and before we wrote our memories down into books and journals and carved them onto stone and fired them into clay tablets, collectively we had a problem. I think that human memory evolved along with all mammals to pass culture from parent to child and to learn from experience. Adding the cultural memory pool to that learned memory created challenges, found limits in the early hominids' mental processes, and I've covered that again in previous episodes, and this is in some ways a revision and a reminder. We grew through evolution selection of people who could better handle culture, better learn, but better pass that learning on. Our brains grew in size. We grew more specialist regions to process, to think, to deal with speech, to deal with abstract reasoning, to deal with visual reasoning. Our brain capacity to process the more complex Umwelt that abstract culture allowed grew existing capabilities and used them for abstraction. We also started to, let me say, invent cultural technologies. These are practices like rhymes and rhythm that combine into songs and singing. This is clearly a cultural invention, and rhyming does something that in computers we do for error correction, which is the checksum. So when you're transmitting digital information, you can't be sure that what was transmitted is what's received, especially when you're dealing with noisy channels. You are transmitting digits 0 and 1, which have been coded with some sort of information, and then taken onto a transmission channel, be that the Morse code of the telegraph or the various means of transmitting radio signal. At the end, when you reconstruct the data that you've transmitted, you have zeros and ones, you have digits. The question is the message intact? Was something corrupted? And for that error correction, what the message gets is something called a checksum. It's a simple way to add up with some sort of algorithm the binary content, and often in binary you get information that is clustered. You get bits, which is the 0 and 1, and then you get bytes, which are clusters of 8 bits. And 8 bits can then represent things like the ASCII alphabet and a few things above that, because in 8 bits you get, I can't remember, 256 unique combinations. And so you can encode text into 8 bits. You can also give each 8 bits a number, because binary is also a counting system. So if you count in binary, you can then use a bit or a byte to checksum a certain number of bits or bytes, and that is the number that we counted, and or some sort of rounding of that number. There's many techniques to try to make the transmission more efficient. But the idea is if the checksum doesn't match the count of the bits or bytes in the message, then we know the message is corrupt, and we go back to the sender and say, please resend. That's now automated in digital communications. Okay, so checksums. Humans, through rhyme, have created a sort of checksum. We can have limericks. There was a young man from wherever who did something wherever, and the rhyming circulatory nature of the limerick or the poem, if we're talking about rhyming poem, or the verse for the song. And singing is probably the most advanced memory culture that society created prior to its expansion and invention of written languages. So the rhyme acts like a checksum. It reminds you that whatever word in the context of the song or the poem or the rhyme needs to be said, needs to match. So it forces a sort of a lock, a recursive lock to meaning. It also uses the way we remember because we associate based on sound. So the sound association of the rhyme builds the word association as well. On top of that, if we add music, our minds have cycles. We, through electroencephalograms, EEGs, have measured brainwaves, electrical cycles and patterns that repeat along certain frequencies, measured as voltage potentials on the surface of the skin of the skull. And by tracking that, we get things like different electrical potential frequency cycles matching certain consciousness states, from being wide awake to being drowsy or dreamy to being sleepy. Before more modern technologies like magnetic resonance imaging, which can track glucose metabolism within the brain itself, and therefore at a relatively fine resolution down to centimeters or millimeters, square millimeters or square centimeters, figure out where the blood flow is going to the brain and therefore which region of the brain is thinking, active, because we equate blood flow with oxygen use, which with glucose metabolism, with with thinking, with neurons firing. Now, it's still not at the detail of individual neurons. We're looking at vast clusters, but we can at least track brain regions. Anyway, I digress again, but hopefully you find these things interesting. So brains are entrained naturally to rhythms, as are our bodies. The musical sound scores of movies use the heart rate. The resting heart rate of the adult is around 60. And so if you want to convey calm in music, you have a rhythm that beats with the heart. If you are excited or active, be it scared, then you beat quickly. And the beat is linked to the association with emotion, and that emotional association entrains the thought processes. It's all connected, it's all linked. So, memory in culture is valuable to survival. The more lessons that you can remember over generations and through disasters where you might lose your elders through a raid or a famine or disease. So the cultural system of remembering becomes distilled and fine-tuned, much like the individual system of remembering has throughout the history of mammalian culture and before then. So we're talking tens of millions of years. It's debatable how long hominids had speech, perhaps a couple of million years, maybe less, but that's how long spoken culture has had to reflexively couple with our biology, grow our brains, modify our bodies, and develop and improve technologies. We talk of this as the Stone Age. We have the stone tools, the flint, the spear, the arrow, the bow, the boomerang, fire and fire practice. We have the songs of the ancestors, which is about as traditional and tribal as you can get. And I recall a lament, I think, from a famous speech from Chief Seattle, where he talks about his reflections on the culture of the Western invaders. And one of the sad lines is, "When the songs of the ancestors are heard no more." So the songs of the ancestors represent a collective memory, a collective culture. And we see the same sort of collective cultural reinforcement of combined singing, alive and well, in the church, especially the Christian evangelical churches, where singing and joy of worship is one. But we have the hymns as a cultural reinforcement of the Christian belief system. And by breathing together and singing together, we also entrain our collective consciousness. We reinforce that we are one body, we have one breath, we have one collective culture, one collective memory. So singing together is useful, not just as memory, but also for collective bonding. We have storytelling by the firesides, so stories by law keepers or wisdom keepers can share cultural memory that is preserved amongst a few specialists. We also have song and dance, where the rhythm is internalized into the body and it becomes more an emotional bonding. It can also be part of the storytelling. So the story is more deeply embedded into the body itself. And so movements combine with rhythm and rhyme to further reinforce the collective memory. Just from personal experience, there seems to be a certain period where we imprint these sort of cultural memories more strongly than others. And I would say it's between childhood and the early stage of adolescence, the teen years where we grow into young adults. That's when pop music has its greatest sort of impact, where the individual child has moved on from the parenting phase to the social integration phase. And the fact that music, and I can still remember lyrics that I learned in my teens, and yet I have trouble imprinting now. Most of the music that I remember is from that period. And I think that's a common biological trait. And I dare say that's yet one more biological adaptation, um, because there is a certain age where children need to be nurtured and cared for by their parents. That age then swaps over to where the children start to interact with the general village, the culture. For some, it's really young, like 6. For others, it's old, like 12. But there's a crossover. And then there's an age before the child becomes an adult. I think we still have ceremonies that sort of mark those ages. School still has a sort of, there's a ball which goes with sort of maturity, which is an echo of the sort of adult transition. Religions, especially the Jewish tradition, has, and the Catholic traditions, have fixed ceremonies, one around adolescence itself and one around the end of adolescence where we reach adulthood. And that period between the beginning and end of adolescence seems to be when our minds are most open to cultural imprinting, to becoming the memory carriers of the songs of our ancestors, of the music. With the Australian Aborigines, the native tribes of this country before the Europeans came, there was a tradition that the lands were protected, especially in the harsh deserts, by the songkeepers of the paths. So if you were to travel through someone's tribal lands, you met at the border and you were given a song that would take you to your destination. It was something you had to memorize, and it described the path you would take along with the landscapes you had to look out for. And if you memorized the song and carried it well, then the song took you from one border to another border according to your journey. And then you would need to learn the next song. And the entire Australian continent was mapped through songlines. And that was the way that information technology preserved geographical maps and also protected those maps, because if you limited the knowledge of the local geography of strangers, it meant that the tribal landholders always had an advantage over invaders who would invade their home. So it was a long-term practice that also helped preserve the peace, the balance between tribal boundaries and borders. Okay. Culture itself preserves memory beyond the individual lifetime. Collectively, that memory is compartmentalized. In a previous episode, I talked about specializations between males and females. Today, I've talked about adaptive specializations. Adaptive specializations of the brain that now reflects the technology of songs and rhyming and rhythm and dance, which are all ways where culture and memory can be enhanced beyond what the pre-verbal memory system already evolved to carry with the culture of the primates of the group without the abstraction of words. With that sort of culture, memories can go far, tribes can carry local geographies, as with my story about the Aboriginal mapping of this country. But the big frontier is the simple number of humans that can carry the cultural story. And I think that is the next big expansion, where the Dunbar's number becomes the limit between us and them. We can offset different specialities to different cultures, and that is true even now, where different regions become specialist metalsmiths or glass blowers or horse breeders. So by specialising to your geographic abundance and using intertribal trade, we can still grow the culture without expanding the Dunbar's number. But at a certain stage, we need to expand the tribe, and that gets limits of carrying capacity of the land, and that will be the theme for the next episode. This has been Systems Philosophy on Culture and Memory.